So, the last few weeks here in California have certainly been crazy. Wildfires raging all across the Bay Area, smoke throughout the city, and we are still dealing with COVID 19 and the continued effects that are seen throughout the state. But probably one of the most uncertain events that happened just a week ago involved two of the biggest transportation companies in the state, Uber and Lyft. Last week, on Thursday, August 20th, Uber and Lyft were just hours away from suspending all operations in California. But thanks to a last minute appeal in the courts, they were able to avoid the shutdown. However, that does not mean things are over yet. With all of these uncertainties and endless information floating around, stories like this need an explanation. A simplified explanation. Let's get into it. So, how did this all get started? Well, workers are either considered employees of a company or they can be classified as independent contractors. When the iPhone brought third party apps to the masses, we saw a rapid increase in those working as independent contractors for app centered jobs in what is now known as the gig economy. Now, the benefit of jobs like these is that you can choose your own hours, which gives you flexibility if you are working it strictly as a side job. Jobs like food delivery, handiwork, and ride sharing. It's the same principle as mowing lawns or babysitting when you were a teenager. It's a way to get some extra cash without selling blood plasma. But over the last decade, since the Great Recession of 2008 and the rise of gig economy jobs, many workers have found these jobs have gone from a side hustle to a huge part of what they depend on for income. And it isn't uncommon for a gig worker to be working two or even three of these organizations at the same time. What aimed to solve this was California's Assembly Bill 5, or AB 5 for short. AB 5 was introduced in the California State Legislature on December 3, 2018, as an expansion to the Supreme Court of California Dynamex case. The Dynamex case found that most workers are considered employees and should be classified as such following the ABC check, a three-factor test to establish if workers are in fact able to be classified as independent contractors. This would place the burden of proof of having to establish these workers as independent contractors onto the companies who hire them. Basically, this means people who are hired for these companies will be default employees rather than independent contractors unless the organization can prove otherwise in accordance with the check. The main purpose of AB 5 is to entitle those now classified as employees to labor protections that are not seen for independent contractors. Protections such as minimum wage laws, sick leave, workers' comp, and unemployment. Now, with everything that's been going on in the last several months as the country and the world has been dealing with COVID 19, many of these issues have become much more crucial during this time. Minimum wage is one, since many of these contractors who would typically be working these jobs as a side job are now relying on them as their main source of income. Qualifying for unemployment is another issue that relates directly to COVID as well, and sick leave, well, that's pretty self explanatory. Obviously, many of these issues were important before, but have now been highlighted as crucial during the pandemic. The bill was signed into law by California Governor Gavin Newsom and officially took effect on January 1st, 2020. So, with all these benefits to becoming an employee and such a time when changes are needed, you would think this would be smooth sailing, right? Not quite. For Uber and Lyft, this would mean fundamentally changing how their drivers would operate. Suddenly, they not only need to pay the minimum wage for the hours that they are on the clock, whether they get rides or not, but they must also provide benefits as well. Benefits that typically only went to their workers on the technical side of operations. Uber and Lyft made the choice to launch a PR campaign that would help shift public opinion against this. Initial methods they used included polling their drivers about how they would favor not being able to choose their own hours. Obviously, those polls they shared said this would be an unfavorable situation for drivers and that most of the workers prefer their current state of employment. However, much of the discussion that was drummed up was in regards to drivers not being able to choose their own hours. Uber and Lyft provide no polling data on how workers would feel regarding individual benefits such as sick leave and unemployment. I don't want to say this is misleading, but it definitely avoids painting a more complete picture of how workers for these companies would see this law. Outside of higher courts repealing the AB 5 law, there is another path that Uber and Lyft are able to take. In the state of California, we have something called propositions. If you have an idea and enough money to throw behind it, you can potentially get that proposition put onto the California ballot and made into law. Prop 13 back in the 70s was property tax reduction, Prop 8 back in 2008 was barring same-sex marriage, and Prop 64 back in 2016 legalized adult use of marijuana. The latest proposition finding its way onto the ballot is Proposition 22. This would exclude app-based ride-sharing and food delivery companies from regulations of AB 5. However, before this proposition could be given a yes or a no vote in November, Uber and Lyft would still be subject to AB5 regulation. On August 10, 2020, a California judge ordered Uber and Lyft, who had already been very vocal in their opposition to AB5, to reclassify their employees from independent contractors to employees with benefits. The judge's ruling would take effect in 10 days, which meant these two companies would have to convert their thousands of drivers in California within those 10 days. This obviously would be rather difficult. Both Uber and Lyft plan to appeal this ruling until after the November election, but this appeal was initially denied. They had then said only days before the deadline that it would most likely result in Uber and Lyft shutting down operations unless either the ruling was changed or an appeal was granted. On August 20th, 2020, Lyft made an official statement detailing that by midnight, the company would cease operations in the state of California due to AB5. Uber was expected to make a similar statement, but a last-minute ruling granted a stay for Uber and Lyft to continue operations in California without converting their employees. This all happened hours before the midnight deadline. The appeal trial will happen sometime in October, but it is unlikely to be completed by the November election, meaning that the voters in California will ultimately have the final say on this matter when they get to vote yes or no on Proposition 22. For Uber and Lyft, they have recently taken to forming a coalition with DoorDash, Instacart, and Postmates and have poured over $100 million into the Yes campaign on Proposition 22. Overall, there are still a great number of things that will ultimately need to be worked out when aiming to help classify millions of independent contractors as employees. AB5 is still facing objections from certain groups who want exemptions from the law, and with a vote on Prop 22 getting closer every day, it's becoming more clear that this will set a precedent for companies who operate not just in California, but throughout the country as well. Things won't always be met with optimism, and it's true that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach that will work for everyone. However, to take on the issues that we have seen over the last decade as the gig economy has grown exponentially, some form of action must be taken, whether that means some or all of what AB5 is currently bringing to the table. If we can enjoy the massive benefits brought to the consumer level by gig workers from DoorDash, TaskRabbit, Uber, and Lyft, the least we can do is ask for those workers to bring home a more equitable share of the benefits as well.